Greetings, Alpine Abbey. Did you miss me? I'm back. So this week, we're going to talk about character in a political world. And before you think, oh no, he's getting all political again, that's not what I'm talking about. Life is political. By political, we mean, as the Greeks said, affairs of the city. Life. How we arrange our life and how we interact with other is politics. It's political. I'm not talking about a donkey or an elephant. But those do affect our lives. So today we're going to talk about how Paul understood his role and what this means in our context. So just this week, a couple things that bothered me. In our society, first we have our new Secretary of Defense, who used to work for the arms manufacturer Raytheon, and still a stockholder. Just made the decision to sell a large amount of arms to Chile. And we also have the acquittal of former President Donald Trump from the impeachment due to the insurrection at the Capitol a few weeks back. Here we are yet again with another member of our government from both political parties profiting off of bloodshed, profiting off of the military-industrial complex. War. Something that is in direct opposition to Christ. And we've also got a continued lack of accountability. A lack of accountability for nonstop gaslighting and lies. And the result of all of that. What is our Christian response? So today in the lectionary, we've got a very well-known passage in Corinthians. And the thesis of Paul's letter here, of this section of Paul's letter, is that Paul is to be all things to all people. What does that mean? Well, there's larger understandings, as in our societal context. There's organizational understandings. Our church, how are we as a church to understand this text and what does this mean for our lives? And then there's the personal. How do you be all things to all people? What does that mean? It starts with understanding who Paul is. Paul's context. Paul was a Pharisee, a Jewish teacher, a very specific type of Jewish teacher that was very regimented in the laws of their Jewishness, of Israel. What that meant. Jesus' constant critique of the Pharisees, but they were too caught up in the letters of the law. Not that the letters of the law were bad, but that they were so caught up in the finer points, into loopholing things to show their own righteousness by their adherence to the laws, while their hearts needed to be in check. Paul admits he was one of these people. Paul oversaw the execution of Christians. But then Paul had a change of heart. He had a mystical experience with Jesus. And things changed. Now, Paul was considered a citizen of Rome. Where he was born, his birthright, he is a Roman citizen. But Paul is an adamant Jew, which was very much against a lot of... They were at odds with Rome frequently. But, after his conversion to Christianity, he was even more of a threat to Rome. And, of course, they didn't call it Christianity at that time. After his conversion to following Jesus, it changed his life completely. So we got to understand his context. I mentioned politics. Paul was dealing with the politics of Rome, his former tribe, Israel. Now, he's still Jewish, but not in the traditional understanding. So his former, yet not entirely former, but kind of former tribe, Israel. The politics of, even though he was within Rome, a lot of his ministry was roaming from Rome itself, but mostly in the Eastern Mediterranean, Israel, what would now be Syria, what would now be Turkey, and Greece. This was the letter to the Corinthians. So part of the politics in Paul's background that is informing this letter is the Greek understanding. Because Greek culture still existed even though it was under the Roman Empire. So Paul is speaking this, or I should say writing this letter, as he's wrestling with his own Jewishness, following Christ, the Greek context that Corinth was in, and the greater Roman context. That's a lot to juggle. As you can see, this understanding of politics is much larger than just picking on the latest thing that happened in our nation. So Paul starts this letter before today's lectionary text, talking about what rights he has as an apostle. See, here's Paul is now laying down what it means to have the character of someone that follows Christ and what that means to him personally. Paul here first talks about that as an apostle, he has the rights to do his ministry traveling with a wife, with family. The other apostles had that. Peter, the first pope of the Catholic Church, was married. I know that surprises a lot of people that know of the unmarried priesthood. Peter was married. Most of the apostles married. In this letter, Paul says that he and Barnabas were the ones who were not. Paul, while having these rights, gave up those rights in order to pursue the character of ministry that he felt called to. Next, he talks about, still in the verses preceding today's text, that as an apostle, he had the right to be paid as a clergy member, like in the same way that the church supports me. Most of the apostles were supported by the generosity of the greater church. Paul did not feel the need to claim that right. Rather, he opted to work bivocationally, even though he had the right to be compensated. He felt that was into the nature of his calling, his character. Then now, as we're getting into today's text, Paul talks about being under the law, being with those people who are under the law, being with those people who observe the law, being with the people that are outside the law, the Greeks, the Gentiles, the Romans. What he's saying in his Jewish context, while he knows under his understanding of Christ is that the ceremonial requirements of Judaism were not necessary. If he wanted to eat pork or shellfish, he could. If he wanted to wear a cotton polyester blend, of course that didn't exist back then, he could. But even though he had this right, in order to maintain the character where the gospel was the center of his message around practicing observant Jews, he gave up those rights amongst them and chose to observe their laws. He would not eat pork with a Jew. I'm going to practice something that we talked about on Martin Luther King Day when I shared Martin Luther King's midrash of Paul's letter to American Christians. Obviously, that letter didn't exist. It's a midrash, the concept of reimagining scripture in a different context. This was an ancient Jewish practice. So my midrash of this would be Paul's letter to the American church during a pandemic. Paul would say something along the lines of, While I have the right to not wear a mask, I am forgoing that right to protect and serve you. While the state of Idaho grants us as a church the right to meet in person in our building, I am forgoing that right. I'm giving up that right. I'm becoming like the people who might be ill or might be at risk of being ill in order to better serve them. While I have the right to bear arms, I am a person of peace and choose not to. Now, I'm not saying you can't own a gun, but I'm saying if you choose to observe that right, examine why. Theologically, why do you observe that right? If you choose to meet in a church in person right now, observe, think, why? Why are you doing that? Think through that theologically. Why do you make that decision? If you choose not to wear a mask, why? Why are you making that decision? See, Paul's calling to be all things to all people is actually less about compromising your character, compromising who you are to get along with people. It doesn't mean I'm going to be a Republican when I'm around Republicans. I'm going to be a Democrat when I'm around Democrats. I'm going to become a Vandals fan when I'm around Vandals. I'm going to become a Broncos fan when I'm around Broncos, or in my text, Gators, Seminoles, Duke, UNC. Looking at your house. It's about meeting people where they are, forgoing maybe our personal rights, but not compromising character. See, Paul did not compromise his character when he was being all things to all people. When he was trying to understand and minister to the Gentile culture, he was not forgoing what it meant to be Christian. He was not getting into some of their pagan practices. Some of those pagan practices were wild. Pederasty being one of them. The concept of an older man that has a younger understudy that granted the older man sexual favors. This is a power imbalance, and Paul spoke against it, although it was considered right in their society. When Paul was amongst the Jewish people, while he would observe their laws amongst them, he would not compromise that the laws would be a requirement. No, following Jesus is the requirement. Character is at the forefront. Being all things to all people is understanding character. So what does that mean for us? I think it means in the midst of our volatile political climate in this country, being all things to all people is to converse with, to be friends with, to engage with people of all understandings, but it does not mean to compromise what we know is right. As a Christian, peace is always right over war. As a Christian, truth was always right over lies and gaslighting. We are not to compromise on these things, but we are to engage empathetically and understand with our neighbors. There's an online campaign called the AND campaign, and it's the idea of being theologically and scripturally sound and being focused on social justice, because so often in Christian circles, it's one or the other. It's, are you engaged in your personal holiness? And that's all that matters. Social justice is distraction. And there's another side that it's all, Jesus was the biggest social justice warrior ever, and that you're only supposed to, that is your primary focus. And the personal stuff, the piety and holiness, that doesn't matter. The AND campaign is saying, no, it's a both and. The AND campaign is suggesting that if we devote ourselves to progressivism or to conservatism, we are missing the richness of the gospel. Now, I don't theologically fully identify with the AND campaign. There's some things that they come to understand theologically that I'm not with. For example, they still seem to view LGBTQ, I should say, same-sex marriage as sinful, and I theologically do not understand it that way. It's not just a social justice thing. I theologically do not understand it in the same way they do. But there's a lot to learn from this campaign. The biggest part of it is that we don't get caught up in tribal thinking, progressivism, conservatism. Paul is saying to be all things to all peoples, we have to understand the broader and. But we also need to not compromise our core truth. Not compromise the gospel of Jesus Christ. Not compromise when, even though war has always been a way, that we still need to call it out and speak for a better way. To not compromise that when lying is evident in front of us, that even though a large majority of our neighbors don't see it that way, that we don't compromise. Lying is wrong, regardless who does it. Now, onto the church side of things. So that's the political. That's how do we be all things to all people on the broader political realm. The church side of things. How do we be all things to all people? You know, I've kind of got this grand vision of this buildingless church where church meets on the slopes, on the river, or in bars. And we are a contemplative yet engaged group that is super intellectual. And you know what? This doesn't work for everybody, but it does work for some. There's beauty in what happens in our traditional building. And while I can be all things as a pastor to this community, part of being all things is appreciating and valuing the tradition that comes in our building, the people that are there, the people that value that, and understand that. That is part of being all things to all people. As a church, we also need to understand that there are people outside of our walls that are never going to come into them. But doesn't mean they'll never be part of the church, and there might be great ways to engage with them. How are we being all things to all people while the gospel is still the focus? Paul says after the conclusion of today's lectionary text that we've got to be in it to win it. He makes reference to some of the Greco-Roman athletic practices of the time. He talks about being the athlete that is in it to win it. And to win it in this case is to spread the gospel. And that needs to be front and center. And that sometimes means that all of us need to forgo some of our rights, some of our expectations, some of the things that might bring us personal joy for the greater good. That means me. That means you. That means all of us. And lastly, there's the personal. See, being all things to all people sometimes gets translated into saying yes to everything. But sometimes we need to say no. See, in the gospel reading today, Jesus had just healed a bunch of people, and then he escaped and went to pray. And his followers are, where'd he go? Where is he? We need to find him. Jesus, there you are. We've got a lot of more people here to serve. Let's do it. They were excited. They just saw this miracle happen. These miracles happen. They were super stoked about it. And they wanted to be part of it more. And Jesus said, I got other plans. Come with me. We're going elsewhere. Sometimes being all things to all people is trying to connect with a broad group of people, but it doesn't mean compromising our mission. We don't compromise our character. We don't compromise our mission. This is the direction that today's reading is pointing us, and I think it's apropos that these two texts are joined together. And I think it's also apropos, as lectionary often is, that it just happens to coincide with things that are happening in our world around us. So this week, let's ponder, what does it mean to be all things to all people in our greater socio-political realm, being a citizen in our world, our country, our state, our county, our towns, our group of friends? What does it mean to be all things to all people as a church? What does it mean for the we to be all things to all people rather than the me? And then lastly, what does it mean for me to be all things to all people? That is our quest for this week. Go in peace and be all things to all people. Amen.